Rain was pouring over Hart Creek Ranch when a barefoot widow reached Caleb Hart's door with her sleeping son in her arms. 3 riders were climbing the road behind her. She did not ask for money or mercy. She only placed a blood-stained ledger in Caleb's hands and whispered, "Please don't send us back." Then he saw his dead father's private mark pressed into the leather and realized the strangers outside had not come only for the woman. They had come for his ranch. Rain had turned the road to Hart Creek Ranch into black mud when Mara Bell reached the porch after midnight. Her dress clung to her legs, one shoe had split at the heel, and 8-year-old Samuel slept against her shoulder beneath a soaked wool blanket. She had walked the last 2 miles because the wagon wheel had broken in the dark. When Caleb Hart opened the door, Mara did not explain who she was or why 3 riders were climbing the hill behind her. She only begged for one night beneath his roof. Then she pushed a blood-stained leather ledger into his hands. Caleb lowered the lantern toward its cover and went still. Pressed into the worn leather was the double horseshoe mark his father had used on private Hart family contracts. A man shouted from beyond the gate that Mara was a thief and warned Caleb that his ranch would belong to the bank by sunrise. Caleb looked at the frightened child, then at the ledger. Without asking another question, he opened the door wider. Caleb did not ask Mara to defend herself that night. He carried Samuel to the narrow room beside the kitchen, found a dry blanket in an old cedar chest, and set a bowl of stew near the stove for the woman who still stood as though she expected someone to drag her back into the rain. Only after the riders disappeared down the hill did Mara allow herself to sit. Even then, she kept one hand on the blood-stained ledger. By morning, the storm had passed, but the fear had not. Mara Bell had been a widow for 3 months. Before that, she had lived in a small rented house near the eastern edge of Red Hollow with Samuel and her husband, Thomas. Their life had never been comfortable, but it had been respectable. Thomas kept shipping records for cattle buyers and freight companies. Mara helped him at night, adding columns by lamplight, checking receipts, and finding mistakes he was too tired to notice. She had learned numbers from her father, who once owned a general store and believed a sharp mind did not become useless simply because it belonged to a daughter. After her father's death, other relatives had treated that belief like an embarrassment. Thomas had not. That was why Mara understood immediately when something in his ledgers began to look wrong. In the weeks before his death, Thomas had grown quiet. He came home late with mud on his boots and papers hidden beneath his coat. He stopped leaving Samuel alone near the front windows. Once, Mara woke before dawn and found him burning copies of freight bills behind the house. He never told her everything. He only made her promise that if anything happened to him, she would protect Samuel and keep one particular ledger away from Silas Crowe. Thomas died 2 weeks later on a mountain road outside Red Hollow. The town called it an accident. His wagon had overturned in a ravine after the rains failed. By the time Mara reached the undertaker, Silas Crowe had already begun telling people another story. Thomas, he claimed, had stolen money from the bank. Missing funds had supposedly passed through accounts connected to his freight work. Harlan Voss, the bank's attorney, produced papers bearing Thomas's name and declared that the Bell household owed more than Mara could ever repay. She was still wearing black from the funeral when men arrived to inventory her furniture. They took the table where Samuel had learned his letters. They took Thomas's tools, the small stove, 2 chairs, and the mare Mara had hoped to sell for enough money to leave town. By sunset, even the house had been claimed against the supposed debt. No one asked why a man accused of stealing thousands of dollars had left his wife with 6 coins in a kitchen jar. No one asked why the signatures on several documents looked different from the careful hand Thomas used when signing Samuel's school papers. Silas owned the bank. He financed stores, cattle purchases, seed, wagons, and half the mortgages in Red Hollow. People who doubted him rarely doubted him aloud. Mara did not scream when Harlan ordered her from the house. She packed Samuel's birth certificate, 2 dresses, Thomas's coat, and the ledger her husband had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She refused money offered by a neighbor who looked at her with pity. She did not need pity. She needed enough distance to understand what Thomas had died trying to uncover. The ledger became the reason she could not disappear quietly. 2 men began following her before she reached the edge of town. Another searched the boarding house where she spent her first night. Mara knew then that Silas did not simply want repayment. He wanted the book. She spent nearly a week moving between farms and abandoned sheds, never staying twice beneath the same roof. Samuel learned not to ask why they left before dawn. He learned to sleep in his coat. He also learned to keep the small brass button Thomas had given him hidden inside his fist whenever strangers came near. Mara hated that most of all. A child should have been thinking about horses, snow, and Christmas. Samuel had begun thinking about locked doors. Then, while studying Thomas's ledger beneath the light of a freight station lamp, Mara noticed one name appearing again and again beside unexplained transfers. Hart. Some entries were marked Jacob Hart. Others referred only to Hart Creek. Several payments were tied to land east of the ranch and to something called Silver Basin. The records ended abruptly shortly before Thomas died. That was why Mara had walked toward Caleb Hart's door instead of farther into the mountains. Now, in Caleb's kitchen, she finally looked around the ranch she had reached in desperation. Nothing about it suggested wealth. The roof needed work. One window had been repaired with mismatched glass. A stack of unpaid invoices sat beneath a stone on the table. Caleb himself looked like a man who had spent too many winters trying to hold together land that was slowly slipping from his hands. Mara had no intention of becoming another burden. When Caleb stepped outside to check the horses, she began clearing the breakfast dishes. As she lifted a folded notice from beneath an empty cup, a red seal caught her attention. She stopped. The paper was a demand for payment from Crowe Bank. Hart Creek Ranch was listed as collateral for a debt supposedly signed by Caleb's father, Jacob Hart. Mara read the date twice. Then she opened Thomas's ledger and searched until she found the matching mark. The same seal appeared beside a transaction involving a dead cattle broker, whose records Thomas had once questioned. Mara felt the cold return to her hands. There were coincidences in bookkeeping. There were careless entries and honest mistakes. This was neither. For the first time since arriving, Mara understood that Thomas had not written the Hart name because Caleb owed Silas Crowe money. He had written it because someone was stealing Hart Creek Ranch the same way they had stolen everything from her. By sunrise, Caleb had made a decision he did not explain. Mara could stay for a few days. Not as charity, not as a guest. She would help in the kitchen, keep the office in order, and earn her meals in the narrow room beside the stairs. When Caleb told her, Mara accepted before he had finished speaking. She made it clear that she would work for whatever she used. She did not want money she had not earned, and she would not let Samuel grow up believing that kindness meant owing someone his dignity. Caleb seemed to understand. He handed her a small iron key and showed her the room that had belonged to his younger sister years before. The bed was simple, the curtains faded, but the roof did not leak. Samuel stood in the doorway as if he had forgotten what a room with 4 safe walls looked like. That morning, Caleb warmed milk for the boy before riding out. Samuel drank it slowly with both hands around the cup. Mara noticed he stopped watching the door. The peace lasted until Edwin Pike came in from the barns. Pike had managed Hart Creek longer than Mara had been married. He was broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the ranch could not function without him. When he learned Caleb had allowed a stranger to stay, his expression tightened. When he learned Mara would be sorting the office, it hardened. The ranch was already in enough trouble, he reminded Caleb. Crowe Bank was waiting for payment. Winter feed had to be purchased. They could not afford to let outsiders wander through private records. Mara did not defend herself. She carried dishes to the wash basin and listened. Pike wore a ring of keys at his belt. One of them was larger than the rest and blackened from years of use. Every time he entered the office, his hand touched that key without thought. By noon, Mara understood why. The ranch books were kept in a locked cabinet behind Caleb's desk. Caleb opened it himself. He told Pike that if Mara could find even one mistake that saved Hart Creek money, then she had earned the right to look. Pike said nothing more, but the glance he gave Mara stayed with her long after he left. She began with the harmless papers: feed receipts, wagon repairs, salt purchases, veterinary bills, freight charges. At first, the numbers looked like the accounts of any struggling ranch. Expenses were too high. Income came too slowly. Winter always seemed to arrive before the money did. Then Mara found a feed invoice for nearly twice the grain she had seen stored in the barn. She checked the date. She checked the quantity again. The invoice had been approved with Caleb Hart's signature. When he returned in the afternoon, she placed it in front of him and asked where he had been on the 12th of September. Caleb frowned. 3 days north, moving cattle toward the rail line. Mara turned the page so he could see the signature. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb knew his own handwriting. That was not it. Pike appeared in the doorway before Mara could say more. He dismissed the mistake as poor bookkeeping. A clerk in town could have copied the signature. An invoice might have been entered twice. Mara agreed that either was possible. Then she asked why Crowe Bank had paid the invoice directly from Caleb's loan account. Pike's face changed, only slightly. But Mara had spent months watching men lie over numbers. She saw it. Caleb saw her see it. Mara did not accuse Pike. She only asked for the remaining invoices from the same month. Pike said several had been moved to storage. Mara asked which storage. For the first time, he had no quick answer. Caleb told him to bring every record before supper. Pike left without arguing. Later, while Samuel helped fold clean cloths near the stove, Mara went back through the invoice. A thin piece of paper had been pressed between 2 pages, probably used as a marker and forgotten. She lifted it carefully. It smelled faintly of clove tobacco. At the bottom was a notation she had seen before in Thomas's ledger. C.B. Transfer approved. Crowe Bank. The same bank claiming Hart Creek could no longer meet its debts had been using Caleb's loan account to pay for goods the ranch had never received. Mara looked toward the window. Across the yard, Pike stood beside the barn speaking to a rider she did not recognize. The man handed him an envelope. Pike slipped it inside his coat and looked toward the house. Mara stepped back from the glass before he could see her. That evening, she carried the false invoice to Caleb. She did not tell him Pike was guilty. Not yet. She only placed the paper beside Thomas's ledger and told him there was something worse than unpaid debt inside Hart Creek's books. Someone had been borrowing money in Caleb's name, and someone inside the ranch had been helping them do it. That night, after Samuel had fallen asleep and the last ranch hand had crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse, Mara carried Thomas's ledger into Caleb's office. She worked beneath a single oil lamp. One column at a time, she compared the ranch accounts with the names Thomas had recorded before his death. Feed purchases, freight payments, loans, cattle sales. Small charges that looked ordinary alone began forming a pattern when placed beside one another. Money was leaving Hart Creek in 3 different ways. Some payments went to suppliers who had never delivered the full amount of goods listed on their invoices. Others went to cattle buyers who purchased Hart animals below market value, then resold them through a freight company connected to Crowe Bank. The third group troubled Mara most. They were payments recorded as interest on Caleb's debt, yet Thomas's ledger listed the same amounts as transfers into accounts controlled by Silas Crowe. Caleb stood quietly behind her chair as she marked each connection. He did not understand every figure, but he understood what disappearing money looked like. Mara explained that 1 false invoice could be a mistake. 2 could be carelessness. But years of matching transfers, altered signatures, and missing cattle could only happen by design. Caleb asked how she had learned to see such things. Mara hesitated before answering. Her father had owned a general store when she was young. He taught her to add columns before he taught her to sew. After he died, her uncles took control of the store and laughed when she asked to keep the books. They said numbers were no place for a woman. Thomas had been different. He had placed the ledger in front of her during their first winter together and trusted her judgment when no one else did. That trust had become the last thing he left behind. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Mara closed Thomas's ledger at once. Samuel appeared in the doorway, pale and frightened. He had heard a horse outside and believed the riders had returned. Caleb did not enter the boy's room or reach for him. He remained near the doorway and spoke softly enough that Samuel had to listen. No one was taking him anywhere that night. Samuel looked at his mother before finally returning to bed. Mara watched Caleb remain in the hall until the boy's breathing settled. Something inside her shifted. For weeks, safety had meant a locked door, a hidden road, or another town beyond the horizon. At Hart Creek, it was beginning to mean something else. A man who did not demand trust before earning it. She returned to the books. Near midnight, Mara found an entry in Thomas's ledger marked with Jacob Hart's full name. Unlike the supposed loan records from Crowe Bank, this entry did not describe borrowed money. It described a payment. Jacob Hart had transferred a large sum to secure permanent water rights beneath land east of Hart Creek. The location was listed as Silver Basin. Caleb leaned closer. His father had spoken about Silver Basin years ago, but only as an old dry valley beyond the eastern ridge. Caleb had never known Jacob had purchased anything there. Mara found another page. The payment had been received. That meant Jacob Hart had given money away, not borrowed it. Yet Crowe Bank had later recorded nearly the same amount as a mortgage loan against Hart Creek Ranch. Mara compared the signatures. The difference was small enough to fool someone who had only seen Jacob's name occasionally. But Caleb knew his father's hand. Jacob always finished the H in Hart with a narrow upward hook. The signature on the bank debt had no hook. Caleb stared at it for a long time. The debt that had shaped nearly every decision of his adult life might never have belonged to his father at all. Before Mara could search further, Edwin Pike entered the office. He said he had seen the lamp burning and wanted to know why they were still awake. His eyes moved from Caleb to Mara. Then they stopped on Thomas's ledger. For less than a second, Pike looked afraid. It vanished quickly, replaced by irritation. But Mara had already seen it. She placed her hand across the book. Pike complained that old paperwork would not bring back lost cattle or change what the bank was owed. He warned Caleb that desperate people often saw conspiracies wherever they looked. Caleb did not answer. Pike eventually left. Only after his footsteps faded did Mara open the ledger again. Something felt wrong. She turned toward the back. One page was missing. The final sheet had been cut close to the binding. Mara ran her finger along the edge. The paper fibers were pale, fresh. That page had been inside the book when she reached Hart Creek. Someone had removed it after she arrived, and there were only a handful of people who knew where she was sleeping. If you believe Mara is hiding part of the truth because she is still trying to protect Samuel, share your thoughts in the comments. Caleb looked toward the dark hallway where Pike had disappeared. For the first time, the danger was no longer somewhere beyond the ranch gate. It was already inside Hart Creek. By the next morning, Mara stopped looking at Hart Creek as a place she had escaped to. She began looking at it as a ranch that could still be saved. The first thing she changed was the way Caleb saw his own losses. For years, he had believed the ranch was simply failing under bad weather, weak cattle prices, and the debt his father had supposedly left behind. Mara showed him something different. She laid out the books across the kitchen table and marked every place where money had disappeared without bringing anything useful back to Hart Creek. The losses were not random. They had a direction. Feed had been purchased at inflated prices. Cattle had been sold too cheaply to the same buyers again and again. Freight costs appeared twice in some months. Repairs were charged for equipment that had never been broken. Caleb stared at the figures with the quiet anger of a man realizing he had spent years blaming himself for wounds someone else had opened. Mara did not tell him to be angry. She told him to be careful. Whoever had done this knew how the ranch worked. That meant they also knew what evidence to destroy if they became frightened. She started with the feed barn. The books claimed Hart Creek had enough grain stored for nearly 6 weeks. Mara counted the sacks herself and found barely enough for 3. She asked 2 ranch hands when the last delivery had arrived. Both remembered only 1 wagon. The invoice listed 2. Edwin Pike blamed the discrepancy on spoiled grain, but no one remembered throwing any away. Mara wrote the difference in a small notebook she kept inside her apron. Then she turned to the cattle records. Hart Creek had sold several dozen head in late summer at prices far below what neighboring ranches had received. Pike had approved the sales and claimed Caleb needed quick cash for loan payments. Mara checked the names of the buyers. 3 belonged to companies tied to the same freight line Thomas had investigated. She showed Caleb. This time he did not ask whether she was certain. He asked what they should do next. Mara suggested delaying a planned cattle sale by 1 week. Pike protested immediately, warning that prices could fall and the bank expected payment. Caleb looked at Mara. She pointed out that demand was rising at the larger market along the rail line, and that Hart Creek would lose more by selling early than by waiting. Caleb took the risk. 3 days later, the market price rose. The difference was enough to cover the ranch hands' wages for the month. No one called Mara a burden after that. The men began asking her to check receipts before purchases were approved. One brought her a torn saddle strap because he had noticed she repaired things carefully. Another left a basket of apples outside the kitchen without saying who had brought it. Mara accepted none of it as praise. She simply kept working. Her attention shifted from the books to the ranch itself. While walking near the north pasture, she noticed the fence posts leaning after days of rain. Pike insisted they would hold until spring. Mara disagreed. The soil had softened beneath 3 of the main posts. One hard push from a frightened herd could bring down the entire line. Caleb ordered the fence reinforced before nightfall. Pike called it wasted labor. That night, A dead pine came down during a burst of wind near the pasture. The noise startled the cattle. Dozens surged toward the northern fence. The repaired posts held. Had they failed, Hart Creek could have lost a large part of the herd into the ravine beyond the ridge. Caleb said very little when the danger passed. The next morning, he placed a fresh pencil beside Mara's notebook. It was the first thing he had ever bought specifically for her. Later that day, one of the mares developed a fever. Pike wanted the animal put outside until the sickness passed. Mara remembered watching Thomas care for freight horses and suggested keeping the mare sheltered, cooling her gradually, and making sure she drank. Caleb let her try. By evening, the mare was standing. By the following morning, she was eating. Samuel spent half the day beside the stall, whispering to the animal as though they had survived something together. The ranch was changing in small ways. So was Mara. Her shoulders no longer tightened every time someone entered a room. She left Samuel playing near the barn without checking on him every few minutes. Once, Caleb heard her humming while she prepared supper. He did not mention it. He only stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary before returning outside. But the deeper Mara went into the records, the more dangerous the pattern became. She found a series of monthly payments listed under equipment maintenance. The amounts were small enough that Caleb had never questioned them, yet the money did not go to a repair company. It went to an account controlled by Edwin Pike. Mara checked the dates. Each payment arrived shortly after Hart Creek sold cattle below market price. The same pattern repeated for more than 2 years. She showed Caleb the page without saying Pike's name. He recognized it anyway. For a long time, Caleb remained silent. Pike had worked beside his father. He had helped bury Jacob Hart. He had stood beside Caleb during winters when other hands left for easier work. That history made the truth harder, not easier. Mara understood that. She told Caleb that loyalty should be measured by what a person protects, not how long he has stood beside you. Before Caleb could answer, Samuel ran into the kitchen. He had been playing behind the office and found something among the ashes of a small burn pile. A piece of paper. Most of it had blackened around the edges, but part of the writing remained. Mara unfolded it carefully. At the top was the seal of Crowe Bank. Near the bottom, only 6 words could still be read. Transfer ownership, after completion of auction. Caleb stared at the burned page. The ranch had not merely been robbed slowly. Someone had already planned who would own Hart Creek after it was taken from him. The first thing Mara noticed was the coffee. For nearly a week, Caleb had left the house before sunrise. He usually drank his cup standing near the stove and carried the rest of the morning with him into the cold. Now, each day, a second cup waited beside the ledger. He never mentioned it. Mara never thanked him aloud. She simply began drinking it while the windows were still dark. Small things became easier at Hart Creek. Samuel stopped sleeping in his coat. He began leaving his boots near the kitchen door instead of beside the bed, as though some part of him finally believed they would still be there in the morning. One afternoon, Caleb found him standing beside a small blue roan mare in the corral. The horse was gentle and patient, but Samuel would not touch her. Caleb did not laugh. He showed the boy how to stand where the mare could see him, how to hold out one hand, and how to wait. Samuel tried again. The mare lowered her nose into his palm. By the end of the week, Caleb had placed Samuel in the saddle. Mara watched from the fence. At first, every muscle in her body tightened when the horse moved. Then Samuel laughed. It was not the careful smile he had worn for adults since Thomas died. It was loud, surprised, and completely unafraid. Mara turned her face away for a moment. She had almost forgotten the sound. That evening, she found Caleb's old coat draped across a chair. One sleeve had torn along the seam. She repaired it after Samuel went to bed. She used dark thread so the stitches would not show. The next morning, Caleb put the coat on, noticed the repair, and looked toward her. Mara kept her attention on the stove. Neither said anything. But after that, he stopped leaving his gloves on the porch when they were wet. He placed them near the fire where she could see them. Trust had begun to take the shape of ordinary things. The burned bank paper changed the mood of the ranch. Caleb kept it locked inside his desk with Thomas's ledger. He no longer allowed Pike to handle financial records without another person present. Pike obeyed, but his resentment grew. Mara could feel it whenever he entered the room. Still, the days continued. One cold afternoon, Caleb was repairing the north fence when a length of wire slipped and tore across his palm. He returned to the barn with blood running between his fingers. Mara saw it before he reached the house. She made him sit on an overturned feed crate. The cut was not deep, but it was dirty. She washed it carefully with warm water and wrapped it with clean cloth. Caleb watched her hands. Mara became aware of how close they were. For a moment, she stopped breathing. Caleb noticed. He moved his injured hand away first, not because he disliked her touch, because he understood why closeness could still frighten her. That kindness hurt more than pressure would have. Later, rain began tapping against the barn roof. Mara stayed to bring in the last blankets before they grew damp. A horse shifted suddenly in the rear stall. The hard sound of a hoof striking wood sent panic through her before she could stop it. She dropped the blanket. Caleb was only a few steps away. He did not reach for her. He sat on a crate across the aisle and waited. The rain filled the silence. Mara pressed both hands together until the shaking eased. Then, without looking at him, she finally told him what she had not told anyone in Red Hollow. Thomas had not died of illness. He had been found below a mountain road beside an overturned wagon. The town called it an accident. Mara had believed that for one night, then she saw the reins. They had not snapped. They had been cut. Thomas had discovered something in the bank records days earlier. He came home frightened and told Mara that men with money could make a lie look official if they owned enough ink, seals, and witnesses. He promised to explain everything after one final trip. He never came home. Silas arrived before the burial was finished. Within days, the theft accusations began. Mara had spent every night since wondering whether Thomas died because he knew too much. Caleb listened without interrupting. He did not tell her what she should have done. He did not promise revenge. He only said that whatever Thomas had uncovered, Mara had carried it farther than the men chasing her expected. That was the first time she let herself believe Thomas's death might still lead to truth. But belief did not erase fear. 2 mornings later, Mara woke before dawn and packed their clothes. She folded Samuel's shirts into the old bag. She wrapped Thomas's ledger in cloth. She placed the brass button beside his birth certificate. Then she stood beside the bed, staring at the room that had begun to feel dangerous for a different reason. It felt like somewhere she could lose. Caleb found her near the kitchen door. He saw the bag. Mara explained that she could not stay while Silas was closing in on Hart Creek. The burned paper proved the bank already intended to take the ranch. If she remained, Caleb might lose everything for protecting a woman he barely knew. Caleb did not block the door. He did not ask her to stay for his sake. He said she was free to leave. Then he looked toward the room where Samuel was still sleeping and told her one thing. A boy who had finally learned to leave his boots by the door deserved one more morning without wondering where he would wake next. Mara closed her eyes. Caleb added that Hart Creek did need help, but that was not why he had opened the door that first night. He had opened it because Samuel was freezing, because Mara was exhausted, because no decent man should require a woman to prove her worth before giving her shelter from a storm. The words settled into a place inside her that had been empty for years. Mara slowly set the bag down. She would stay. Not forever. Not because she owed him. Only until they finished what Thomas had begun. Caleb nodded. Nothing more was needed. Later that afternoon, Mara examined Thomas's ledger again and remembered something she had overlooked. Several days before his death, Thomas had mentioned an old telegraph operator who kept duplicate records longer than required. He never said the man's full name, only that he had witnessed a message Silas would have paid dearly to destroy. Mara was trying to remember more when the sound of wheels came from the road. Samuel ran to the window. A sheriff's wagon was climbing the hill. Behind it rode Silas Crowe, Harlan Voss, and 2 armed men. Mara saw the folded paper in the sheriff's hand before anyone reached the porch. This time, the men outside had not come with threats. They had come with a warrant. The sheriff's wagon stopped in front of Hart Creek just after noon. Silas Crowe climbed down first. He wore a dark wool coat, polished boots, and the same calm expression he had worn when Mara's furniture was carried into the street 3 months earlier. Harlan Voss followed with a leather case under one arm. Sheriff Amos Reed came last, holding a folded document sealed in red wax. Edwin Pike appeared from the barn before Caleb reached the porch. That alone told Mara too much. Pike had known they were coming. Samuel moved closer to her side. Caleb stepped into the yard and stopped between the visitors and the house. No weapon in his hand. No raised voice. Silas smiled as though he had already won. He told Caleb that Hart Creek had become a refuge for a thief. He said Mara Bell had stolen private banking documents, fled lawful seizure, and concealed evidence connected to money her husband had taken before his death. Mara felt every eye turned toward her. The accusation was familiar. That did not make it hurt less. Harlan opened his leather case and produced a second document. This one concerned Hart Creek. The bank intended to auction the ranch in 3 days for failure to repay the debt secured under Jacob Hart's name. Silas said the matter had gone on long enough. If Caleb surrendered Mara and the ledger immediately, Crowe Bank might still show leniency. Caleb asked, "What kind?" Silas glanced at Mara before answering. "More time, perhaps." The word was meant to sound generous. Mara knew what it really meant. Silence in exchange for survival. She stepped forward. If turning herself over could keep Hart Creek from being taken, she was prepared to go. Caleb did not move aside. He asked Sheriff Reed to read the arrest warrant aloud. The sheriff unfolded it. Mara was accused of stealing financial records belonging to Crowe Bank and interfering with the settlement of her husband's debts. When the sheriff finished, Caleb asked where the warrant had been issued. Harlan answered before Reed could. "Red Hollow." Caleb looked at the seal, then at the sheriff. He asked why the lower edge of the wax was blurred. For the first time, Sheriff Reed examined it closely. Silas dismissed the mark as damage from travel. Pike laughed and said Caleb was wasting everyone's time because of a desperate widow who had filled his head with stories. Mara saw Samuel lower his eyes. Pike continued. He said women like Mara survived by finding lonely men willing to believe them. He told the ranch hands that Caleb was risking land his family had held for decades because a stranger knew how to cry at the right door. Mara's face burned. She did not answer. Samuel took her hand. That small gesture kept her standing. Caleb's voice remained quiet. He told Pike to stop. Pike did. Not because Caleb shouted. Because everyone in the yard heard the warning beneath the words. Silas changed tactics. He told Caleb the woman behind him had brought ruin everywhere she went. Her husband was dead. Her home was gone. Now Hart Creek was days from auction. It was easy, Silas said, to see the pattern. Mara felt something old and poisonous stir inside her. For months, people had treated tragedy like evidence of guilt. Caleb did not look back at her. He kept his eyes on Silas. Then he asked one question. If Mara was nothing but a worthless widow carrying useless stolen papers, why had the most powerful banker in Red Hollow ridden all the way to Hart Creek with a lawyer, armed men, and an auction notice just to retrieve one ledger? No one answered. Sheriff Reed looked at Silas. Mara saw the first crack appear. Caleb asked for time to examine the warrant and the debt papers. Silas refused. Harlan insisted the documents were lawful. Reed hesitated. Caleb reminded the sheriff that arresting someone under a questionable seal would be difficult to undo after the fact. Reed finally agreed to wait until sunset. If the papers proved valid, Mara would have to surrender. If she ran, Caleb would be held responsible. Silas accepted, though his smile had disappeared. Mara knew 4 hours would not save them, but 4 hours could expose a lie. As the men moved away from the porch, Pike disappeared around the side of the house. Samuel noticed. He tugged Mara's sleeve and whispered that Pike was going toward their room. Mara followed quietly. By the time she reached the hallway, Pike had already opened the door. He was searching the mattress. Mara stopped in the doorway. Pike turned. For one frozen second, neither moved. Then Mara saw what protruded from his coat pocket. A narrow strip of cream paper. The edge matched the cut in Thomas's ledger. Pike realized where she was looking. He shoved the paper deeper into his coat. Mara did not call for Caleb. She asked Pike why he had taken it. His face hardened. He told her she did not understand what men like Silas could do to a family. Mara said she understood better than he knew. Pike's hand went to the small knife at his belt. The handle was cracked. Mara remembered the clean cut beside the missing page. She stepped back. Caleb entered the hallway behind her. Pike froze. Caleb asked him to hand over the paper. Pike refused at first. Then Sheriff Reed appeared at the front door, drawn by the raised voices. Pike's courage collapsed. He pulled the page from his coat, but it was not the whole page. Only a torn corner. Mara recognized Thomas's handwriting along the edge. The rest was gone. Caleb asked where it was. Pike looked toward the yard where Silas waited. His voice dropped. The last page, he said, had been taken to Red Hollow long before Mara arrived. Silas had kept it ever since the night Thomas Bell died. The sheriff heard every word. Outside, Silas turned toward the house. For the first time, the banker looked afraid. If you were Caleb, would you still risk Hart Creek to protect Mara after seeing how far Silas was willing to go? Share your answer in the comments. Pike stared at the floor. Then he said the one thing no one expected. The page Silas had stolen was not merely proof of forged debt. It named the person who would own Hart Creek after the auction. Sheriff Reed asked everyone to return to the yard. The torn corner of Thomas's missing page remained in his hand. For the first time since arriving, Silas Crowe no longer looked like the man controlling the afternoon. Caleb stood beside Mara near the porch steps. Samuel remained inside the doorway where she could see him. Harlan Voss demanded that the arrest continue. Caleb ignored him. He asked Sheriff Reed to compare the warrant with another official document from Red Hollow. Reed pulled an old notice from his satchel. Mara examined both seals. The difference was small. The sheriff's real seal pressed a thin ridge through the center of the star. The seal on Mara's warrant did not. Harlan called it meaningless. Mara asked to see the signature. The ink on Reed's name was darker than the writing above it. Fresh ink, different pressure. Someone had prepared the document first and added the sheriff's name later. Reed's expression changed. He had not signed that page. Silas insisted a clerk must have made a mistake. Mara looked at Caleb. He went inside and returned carrying the bank papers connected to Hart Creek's debt. If one mistake could be excused, he said, perhaps four could not. They spread the papers across a wooden table in the yard. Mara began with the oldest mortgage. The bank claimed Jacob Hart had signed it 6 years earlier. Caleb read the date. Then he went still. Jacob had been dead for 11 days when the document was supposedly signed. Silas answered too quickly. The date could have been entered late. Mara shook her head. A late entry might explain one date. It could not explain the signature of a dead man. Caleb brought out the family Bible where Jacob's death had been recorded, along with the physician's old certificate he had kept in a tin box. Sheriff Reed studied them. He had known Jacob Hart for more than 20 years. He remembered the way Jacob signed his name. Caleb placed one genuine letter beside the mortgage. The difference was clear once someone knew where to look. Jacob's real signature ended with the narrow upward hook Mara had noticed earlier. The bank version did not. Harlan tried to collect the papers. Caleb put one hand over them. Not roughly, just firmly enough to stop him. Silas told Sheriff Reed that none of this changed Mara's theft. Mara answered that it changed everything. If the warrant had been forged and Hart Creek's debt had been created after Jacob's death, then Crowe Bank had no right to demand the ledger as its property. It might be evidence against the bank. Sheriff Reed agreed. Until the documents could be examined properly, Mara would remain at Hart Creek under Caleb's responsibility. Silas demanded her immediate arrest. Reed refused. The banker's face tightened. He warned Caleb that protecting Mara could still cost him every acre his father left him. Caleb stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. If Silas had come looking for trouble, he had found enough of it. If he had come for Mara, he would be leaving without her. The yard fell silent. Mara watched Caleb from behind him. He was not claiming ownership over her. He was protecting her right to stand there and speak for herself. That difference mattered more than he knew. Silas finally turned toward his horse. Before leaving, he reminded them that the auction would still begin the next morning unless they produced proof strong enough to stop it. Caleb asked Sheriff Reed to hold Pike for questioning. Pike looked terrified. He said he had never wanted Thomas dead. Mara stepped closer. No one had accused him yet. The words seemed to break something inside him. Pike admitted that Silas had been paying him for years to approve false invoices and undervalued cattle sales. At first, the amounts had been small. Then Silas threatened to expose Pike's gambling debts and take the house where Pike's sister lived. Pike had kept obeying. He had torn the last page from Thomas's ledger after Mara arrived because Silas told him the page could destroy them all. But Pike had only removed it from the book. The original page had already been copied. Silas kept that copy in a safe behind his private office at Crowe Bank. Caleb asked if Pike knew what was written on it. Pike nodded. Not everything, but enough. It concerned Silver Basin, and a transfer Jacob Hart had completed before his death. Mara asked how they could get the document without breaking into the bank. Pike looked toward Sheriff Reed. There was another way. The bank kept duplicate transaction records in a public filing room behind the county clerk's office. Silas had hidden most of the evidence, but some transfers had been registered there before he realized Thomas was investigating. Pike also had a copied key to the filing cabinet used for older bank records. Sheriff Reed took the key from him. They would go together. No theft. No secret entry. Everything would be opened under the sheriff's authority. Mara agreed. She would not win her freedom by committing the crime Silas had already accused her of. As Reed prepared the wagon, Caleb returned the ledger to Mara. He did not keep it. He did not tell her what to do with it. He placed it in her hands and said the choice was hers. For a moment, Mara could not speak. Every man who had controlled her life since Thomas died had tried to take something from her. Her house, her name, her evidence, her right to decide what happened next. Caleb was doing the opposite. He was giving the decision back. Mara closed her fingers around the ledger. She chose to go to Red Hollow, not because Caleb had asked her, because she was done running from men who expected fear to do their work for them. As they climbed into the wagon, Pike gave them one final warning. The missing page did more than expose a false debt. It showed who held the legal rights to Silver Basin. If that document was still intact, Hart Creek was worth far more than Silas had ever admitted. And whoever controlled the water could control nearly every ranch south of Red Hollow. Red Hollow looked different when Mara returned beside Caleb Hart. The same boardwalks were there. The same church bell hung above the square. The same bank windows reflected the pale afternoon light. But this time, Mara was not carrying Samuel through town with her head lowered while people whispered behind her. This time, she carried Thomas's ledger openly. Sheriff Reed led them first to the county filing room behind the clerk's office. The room smelled of dust, ink, and old paper. Shelves climbed nearly to the ceiling. Boxes of land transfers, freight claims, mortgages, and water agreements filled the walls. Pike's copied key opened an iron cabinet marked with records from 6 years earlier. Mara searched by date. Caleb searched by family name. Sheriff Reed checked each document before allowing it to leave the cabinet. For nearly an hour, they found nothing. Then Mara saw Jacob Hart's name. Not on a loan, on a transfer receipt. She pulled the paper free and laid it beside Thomas's ledger. The amount matched. So did the date. Jacob Hart had paid in full for permanent access to Silver Basin and the underground water rights attached to the eastern tract beyond Hart Creek. The transaction had been completed. There was no mortgage, no unpaid balance, no debt. Caleb read the document twice. For years, he had believed his father had died, leaving Hart Creek buried beneath an obligation too large to escape. Instead, Jacob had left him something valuable enough to save the ranch. Silas had simply changed the meaning of the payment after Jacob could no longer defend himself. Mara turned to the next record. A second filing showed Crowe Bank receiving the money on behalf of a land company. The company's name meant little until she compared it with Thomas's ledger. Crowe Agricultural Holdings. Silas owned it through 2 silent partners. The arrangement was clear now. Jacob had paid Silas for water rights. Silas kept the money. Then he created a false mortgage claiming the same payment had been a loan issued to Jacob. Hart Creek had spent years paying interest on money it had never borrowed. And once Caleb could no longer keep up, Silas planned to take the ranch. Caleb's anger showed only in the way he pressed his palm flat against the table. Mara kept searching. Thomas had not died over a single forged signature. He had found a system. Several ranches south of Red Hollow carried similar debts. Different names, different amounts. The same bank, the same filing patterns. Silas had been weakening ranches one by one, then acquiring their land through companies hidden behind other names. But Hart Creek was the prize. Silver Basin made it different. According to the transfer agreement, Hart Creek held permanent priority rights to water flowing beneath the basin. In a dry year, neighboring ranches would need legal access through Hart land. Whoever owned Hart Creek could decide the future of half the valley. That was why Silas had been willing to wait years. He did not only want Caleb's cattle, he wanted the water. Mara found one more notation in Thomas's ledger. E.W. Telegraph record. Caleb remembered the name of the old operator Mara had mentioned. Sheriff Reed knew him. Elias Webb lived in a small house near the abandoned rail depot. They found him before sunset. Elias was 70, nearly deaf in one ear, and suspicious of everyone who came to his door. Then Mara showed him Thomas's brass button. The old man's expression changed. He remembered Thomas. 3 days before the wagon accident, Thomas had sent an urgent telegram intended for Jacob Hart. Thomas had not known Jacob was already dead. The message warned that Crowe Bank had altered land papers and forged a Hart signature. Elias had kept a duplicate because Thomas had returned the next morning and asked him not to destroy it. He still had the copy, not because he expected anyone to need it after all these years, because the message had frightened him. Elias opened a wooden box beneath his bed and removed a folded strip of yellowed paper. Sheriff Reed read it aloud. Thomas had written that the Hart debt was false. He named Harlan Voss as the man preparing altered papers. He named Edwin Pike as the person giving Crowe access to Hart Creek's internal accounts. And at the bottom, Thomas wrote that if anything happened to him, Silas Crowe should be investigated. Mara did not cry. For 3 months, she had heard Thomas described as a thief. Now his own words were lying on the table between them. He had known. He had tried to warn someone. He had died before the warning arrived. Pike sat down heavily. His face had gone gray. He said he had never meant for Thomas to die. Sheriff Reed told him to explain. Pike admitted that Silas had ordered him to follow Thomas and recover the ledger. Pike had reported Thomas's route out of town. Another man had been waiting farther along the mountain road. Pike did not name him at first. Mara asked whether the reins had been cut before Thomas's wagon overturned. Pike closed his eyes. Yes, Silas had arranged it. The intention, Pike claimed, was to frighten Thomas and take the documents. But Silas knew exactly what could happen on that road if the reins failed. Mara looked down at her hands. For weeks, she had wondered whether Thomas's death was an accident she had turned into a conspiracy because grief needed someone to blame. Now the truth was worse. Silas had not merely stolen her home after Thomas died. He had helped create the death that made her a widow. Caleb remained beside her. He did not touch her until Mara reached for his hand first. Then Samuel, who had been sitting quietly with Elias's old dog near the stove, walked over and placed the brass button from Thomas's coat on the table. Mara stared at it. Thomas had given the button to Samuel the morning before his last trip. Samuel said his father told him never to lose it because there was something inside for his mother. Mara had always believed Thomas meant the memory of him. Elias asked to see the button. There was a thin seam around its edge. Caleb used the tip of a small knife to twist it open. Inside was a tiny piece of folded paper. Mara could barely breathe. On it, Thomas had written a filing number. Below the number was one name, Elias Webb. The button had been Thomas's final safeguard. If the ledger was stolen, Mara would still have the path to the witness. If the witness survived, the truth could still be found. For the first time since Thomas died, Mara understood that he had not left her helpless. He had trusted her to finish what he could not. Sheriff Reed gathered the documents. The genuine Silver Basin transfer. The false mortgage. Thomas's telegram. The filing number hidden inside the button. Pike's statement. Together, they were enough to stop the auction. Then a deputy burst into the room. The auction had already begun. Silas had moved it forward by several hours. A buyer from outside the territory was standing in front of Crowe Bank. The first bids had been taken, and Silas was preparing to sell Hart Creek before anyone could reach the square. By the time Mara, Caleb, Sheriff Reed, and Elias reached the square, the auction was already underway. A crowd had gathered in front of Crowe Bank. Ranchers stood beside shopkeepers, freight drivers, churchwomen, and men who had once looked away when Mara was forced from her home. At the center of it all stood Silas Crowe. He looked composed again. A stranger from outside the territory had already made the highest bid for Hart Creek. Harlan Voss stood beside the auction table with the transfer papers ready. Silas raised his hand and called for the final count. Sheriff Reed shouted for the auction to stop. The square fell quiet. Silas turned slowly. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mara stepped forward carrying Thomas's ledger. The whispers began almost at once. Some people still called her a thief. Others stared at Sheriff Reed and realized something had changed. Silas told the crowd that Mara Bell was under investigation and had no standing in the sale. Sheriff Reed answered that the warrant against her was fraudulent. That silenced more people. Harlan protested. Reed held up the document and explained that his signature had been added without his authority, and the seal was not the official sheriff's seal. Mara could feel every face turning toward her. 3 months earlier, she had stood in this same town while people watched her belongings carried into the street. She had wanted to disappear then. Now she walked toward the auction table. She did not ask anyone to believe her. She asked them to look at the evidence. Mara placed Jacob Hart's genuine Silver Basin transfer beside the mortgage Crowe Bank claimed he had signed. She showed the dates first. Jacob completed the Silver Basin purchase before his death. The supposed mortgage was signed 11 days after he had been buried. A murmur moved through the crowd. Caleb placed his father's genuine letters beside the bank document. Mara pointed to the narrow upward stroke in every real Hart signature. The mortgage had none. Silas called it speculation. Mara answered with the county record. Jacob had not borrowed the money listed on the mortgage. He had paid that amount to secure permanent water rights. The receipt was registered. The payment had cleared. The debt had never existed. The buyer who had been bidding on Hart Creek lowered his hand. Silas demanded that the auction continue. No one listened. Mara opened Thomas's ledger. She explained the false feed invoices, the underpriced cattle sales, the transfers through companies connected to Crowe Bank, and the small payments made to Edwin Pike. Then Pike stepped out from beside the sheriff's wagon. The crowd reacted at once. Pike had spent years at Hart Creek. People knew him. His voice shook when he admitted that Silas had paid him to approve false invoices and give the bank access to Caleb's accounts. He confessed that he had helped make Hart Creek look weaker than it was. Silas shouted that Pike was lying to save himself. Pike looked at Mara, then at Caleb. He said there was more. Silas had ordered Thomas Bell followed after Thomas discovered the forged papers. Pike had helped track his route, and Silas had arranged for the reins of Thomas's wagon to be cut. The square went completely still. Mara felt Samuel's hand tighten around hers. For months, people had called Thomas a thief. Now the man who had helped hunt him was confessing in front of them all. Silas tried to leave. Sheriff Reed stepped into his path. Harlan began gathering papers from the auction table. Mara saw him reach for his leather case. Reed took it first. Inside was a metal seal, the false sheriff's seal. There were also blank debt forms already carrying copied signatures, and several drafts of land transfers naming companies tied to Silas. One of those drafts listed Hart Creek. Another listed 2 smaller ranches south of Red Hollow. The fraud was larger than anyone in the square had known. Elias Webb moved forward next. He held the duplicate telegram Thomas had sent before his death. He confirmed that Thomas had warned of altered Hart papers and named Silas Crowe and Harlan Voss. Sheriff Reed read the telegram aloud. No one laughed at Mara after that. No one called her a liar. Silas tried one last time to claim that Thomas had stolen bank records. Mara opened Samuel's brass button. She showed the filing number Thomas had hidden inside. The number matched Elias's retained telegraph copy and the county records. Thomas had created a chain of evidence before his death. Mara had simply followed it. Sheriff Reed ordered Silas and Harlan into custody for fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and their role in Thomas Bell's death. Pike was also taken into custody, though Reed stated that his cooperation would be recorded. The auction was canceled. The false Hart mortgage was seized as evidence. The genuine Silver Basin transfer remained with Caleb. For several seconds after it was over, the square stayed strangely quiet. Mara had imagined this moment many times during nights when Samuel slept beside her in barns and abandoned sheds. She had imagined anger. She had imagined telling every person who had mocked her exactly what their silence had cost. But now that the truth stood in daylight, she felt no need to punish them with words. The truth was enough. A woman near the church steps lowered her eyes. A shopkeeper who had refused Mara food after Thomas's funeral removed his hat. Someone whispered an apology. Mara did not answer. She did not need the town to give her dignity back. They had never owned it. Caleb stepped beside her. He told the crowd one thing. Hart Creek Ranch was still standing because Mara Bell had been willing to look at numbers everyone else ignored and follow the truth after stronger men had tried to bury it. Mara looked at him. There was no pity in his face, only respect. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt the weight of accusation lift from her name. Samuel leaned against her side. The auction buyer walked away. The sheriff's wagon carried Silas and Harlan toward the jail, and Hart Creek remained Caleb's. If Mara's journey has reminded you that truth can survive even when powerful people try to bury it, share this story with someone who might need that reminder. And subscribe if you want more stories about courage, justice, and the quiet kindness that changes lives. As the square began to empty, Caleb asked Mara when she wanted to return home. The word stopped her. Home. She looked toward the road leading back to Hart Creek. Then she remembered the promise she had made herself on the first night. She had only needed shelter. Only one night. Now the danger was over. The ranch was safe. Her name was clear. And for the first time in months, Mara was free to go anywhere she wanted. She looked at Caleb and told him that was exactly what she intended to do. She would leave Hart Creek. 3 weeks later, the first snow came to Hart Creek. It fell softly over the repaired north fence, settled on the roof of the barn, and turned the eastern ridge white before sunrise. The ranch looked different. Not richer, not grander, just alive again. The false debt was gone. The Silver Basin water rights had been restored to Caleb, and neighboring ranchers had already approached him about legal access agreements for the coming dry season. For the first time in years, Hart Creek had enough money to pay every hand on time, repair the barn roof, and buy winter feed without borrowing from Crowe Bank. Mara kept the books, only now her name appeared on the payroll. Caleb had insisted. She had argued that she was already receiving a room and meals. He had answered that work deserved wages. That ended the discussion. Samuel had changed too. He spent mornings carrying small buckets to the barn and afternoons following Caleb around the corral. Bluebell had become his horse in everything but ownership. The boy brushed her until her coat shone and talked to her about things he rarely said to adults. At night, he slept without asking whether the doors were locked. Mara noticed that most of all. Red Hollow sent apologies in different forms. A basket of bread arrived from the church women. The shopkeeper who had once refused Mara food sent a sack of flour without a note. Sheriff Reed delivered a written declaration clearing Thomas Bell's name and every accusation made against Mara. She placed that paper beside Thomas's ledger. Then she closed the box. She did not need to read it every morning. Her name was hers again. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Cheyenne. A bookkeeping firm had heard what happened at Red Hollow and offered Mara a position. The pay was good. There was a school nearby for Samuel. She would have her own rented rooms and no obligation to anyone at Hart Creek. Mara read the letter twice. That evening, she packed one dress. Then she stopped. The old fear returned in a quieter form. Not fear of Silas. Fear of staying for the wrong reason. Hart Creek had sheltered her. Caleb had defended her. The ranch had become safe. But gratitude was not the same as love. And Mara refused to build another life on a debt she could never measure. Caleb found her sitting on the porch with the Cheyenne letter folded in her lap. He did not ask whether she was leaving. He sat on the step below her and waited. Mara told him about the job. Caleb said it sounded like honest work. She told him Samuel could attend school there. Caleb nodded. She told him the pay was enough to rent a small home. Again, he nodded. Mara almost became angry. Some part of her had expected him to give her a reason not to go. Then she realized what he was doing. He was refusing to make the decision for her. Caleb looked out across the pasture. He said Hart Creek would always have a place for Mara and Samuel, but not because they needed shelter. Not because the ranch needed someone to keep the books. Not because he believed she owed him anything for opening the door that first night. If she chose Cheyenne, he would help load the wagon himself. Mara looked down at the letter. Then Caleb said the only question that mattered was whether Hart Creek had become home. The word sat between them. Mara thought of the first night. Rain on the porch. Samuel shivering against her shoulder. Blood on Thomas's ledger. 3 riders coming up the hill. She had expected suspicion when Caleb opened the door. Instead, he had given her a dry blanket before asking for an explanation. She thought of coffee waiting beside the books before sunrise. The repaired fence. Samuel laughing on Bluebell. Caleb sitting across the barn from her during the rain because he understood that kindness did not require touch. She thought of the auction square, where he had stood beside her, but never spoken over her. Hart Creek had not become home because she had nowhere else to go. It had become home because it was the first place where she was allowed to choose. Mara folded the Cheyenne letter. She told Caleb she would not take the job. He looked at her then, not relieved enough to hide it, but he still did not assume what her decision meant. Mara smiled. She said she wanted to stay. Caleb asked if she was certain. She was. Not as a guest, not as a widow he had rescued. As herself. Caleb looked toward the barn where Samuel was laughing with one of the ranch hands. He admitted that he could not promise an easy life. There would be bad winters. Cattle would get sick. Fences would break. Some years would bring too little rain and others too much. But if Mara stayed, her voice would matter in every decision made under that roof. Samuel's would too. Mara felt tears rise, but this time she did not turn away. She reached for Caleb's hand. He closed his fingers around hers. No grand promise was needed. No crowd. No witness. Only two people who had both lost enough to understand the value of choosing carefully what came next. A shout came from the corral. Samuel ran toward the porch with snow on his boots and Bluebell's lead rope in one hand. He was talking too fast about a loose latch when he looked at Caleb and said the word without thinking. Puh. Samuel froze. Caleb did too. Mara watched the boy's face change with embarrassment. Caleb crouched in front of him. He did not correct him. He only asked whether that was what Samuel wanted to call him. The boy nodded. Caleb placed one hand gently on his shoulder. Then Samuel threw both arms around his neck. Mara turned toward the pasture for a moment because she could no longer see clearly. That winter, Thomas's ledger was placed in a cedar box beside Jacob Hart's watch, and the brass buttons Samuel had carried through every frightened night. They were no longer objects of danger. They were reminders. One man had trusted Mara with the truth. Another had trusted her with a choice. Between those two acts, she had found her way back to herself. By spring, Silver Basin water ran through repaired channels toward Hart Creek. The barn roof was new. Samuel had grown too confident on Bluebell, and Mara's small desk stood beside Caleb's in the ranch office. Some mornings, before anyone else woke, Mara would look through the window toward the road where she had arrived, carrying everything she had left in one torn bag. She had asked for one night. Caleb had given her a door that stayed open, but that was not why she remained. She stayed because she had walked through it as a frightened widow and eventually learned that she was still capable of building a life on the other side. One quiet morning, as snow melted from the porch rail, Caleb asked whether she ever regretted coming to Hart Creek. Mara looked at the house, the barn, Samuel riding slowly through the corral, and the man standing beside her. Then she smiled. "It became home the night you opened the door,"